The rain came down in sheets that night, the kind of rain that swallows headlights whole and turns every stretch of coastal highway into a black ribbon of uncertainty. It was a Thursday in late October, and the Pacific fog had already rolled in low over the bridge, swallowing the steel rails and the distant lights of the harbor below. Visibility was near nothing. The world beyond each windshield was reduced to a few pale feet of slicked asphalt, and the only sound above the engine noise was the relentless percussion of water against glass. Nobody should have been on that bridge at that hour, not in weather like that. But Isabella Hart was never the kind of woman who waited for ideal conditions. She had built her entire life on doing what needed to be done, regardless of what the sky was saying. She had left the offices of Hart Dynamics just before 11, carrying the weight of a $7 billion acquisition decision that could not wait another 48 hours. The meeting had gone 4 hours longer than scheduled. Her lawyers were split. Her CFO kept circling the same projections. The board wanted assurances she could not honestly give, and the opposing team had spent the last hour applying the kind of pressure that was meant to feel like inevitability. Isabella had smiled through all of it. She was good at that. 38 years old, founder of one of the most influential technology firms on the West Coast. A woman whose name appeared on 3 consecutive years of the most powerful people in American business lists, and yet in the back of that car, alone, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. She felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The car was a custom build, the kind that cost more than most people's houses, and the driver, her most trusted one, had called in sick that morning. She had waved off the offer of a replacement. She knew the road. She had driven it 100 times. What she had not accounted for was a section of drainage grating that had worked itself loose over 3 weeks of neglect. Invisible under standing water, positioned precisely where the left front tire would find it at 52 miles an hour. The car did not spin gradually. It lurched, corrected once the way well-engineered machines do, and then overcorrected with a violence that gave no time for thought. The guardrail at the edge of the bridge was old. It had been flagged for replacement 18 months prior. It gave way like paper. The car went through it and over the edge, and the darkness of the water below rose up to meet it. The impact was colossal. The car hit the surface at an angle that crumpled the hood inward and shattered every window simultaneously. The airbags deployed, but the force was enough to knock Isabella unconscious before the vehicle had finished its first rotation beneath the surface. Cold salt water flooded the interior in seconds. The car sank fast, pulling downward with the indifferent efficiency of physics, and Isabella Hart, who had survived every negotiation ever thrown at her, was completely and utterly at the mercy of something that did not know her name. He had been walking back from the supply dock. That was the honest truth of it. No drama, no premonition. Just a man finishing a late errand in the rain because the part he needed had finally come in and he wanted to start early the next morning. Ethan Cole was 41 years old, and he had been walking the stretch of coast road beneath that bridge for going on 6 years. Long enough that he could have walked it with his eyes closed. He heard the guardrail go before he saw anything. Then he heard the impact on the water. A sound that could not be mistaken for anything else by anyone who had spent years around the sea. He did not hesitate. He ran to the water's edge, stripped off his jacket without breaking stride, and went in. The water was 53 degrees. In October, in the dark, with the rain still hammering the surface, it was a cold that took the breath with the force of a physical blow. Ethan had trained for this once, years before, in a version of his life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The training came back the way muscle memory always does, not through thought, but through the body. He dove under and found the car already 10 feet down, sinking but slowed by trapped air. He found the window frame on the driver's side. He found the seatbelt latch through pure touch in zero visibility. He found her, and he pulled. Getting her to the surface took everything he had. She was limp, completely unresponsive, and the weight of her soaked clothing and his own resistance against the current meant that by the time his head broke the surface, he had very little left. He swam her to the shallow rocks below the bridge on sheer will, dragged her up onto the flat stone shelf, checked her airway, and began compressions. Somewhere behind him, up on the bridge, someone had stopped and was calling emergency services. He could hear the voice but paid it no attention. His whole world had narrowed to the woman in front of him and the rhythm he was maintaining, and the single, furious refusal to let this end the way the last one had. She breathed. It was not a grateful breath. It was a gasping, drowning animal breath that rattled and caught, and then slowly, over the next 20 seconds, stabilized into something that resembled a living rhythm. Ethan sat back on his heels. His hands were shaking from cold and exertion. His shoulder, which he had torn against the doorframe going in, was sending sharp signals up through his neck that he was choosing to ignore. He looked at her face in the thin light that had begun filtering down from the bridge above emergency lights now. Someone had arrived fast, and he saw a woman who was, against considerable odds, still alive. She opened her eyes once, just for a moment, before the paramedics reached them. Her eyes found his face in that pale light, and she gripped his wrist with a strength that surprised him. Her lips moved. The rain was too loud and she was too far gone for anything to be clear. But he heard it. He was close enough to hear it. "Please," she said. And then a breath. And then, "Don't die." He might have told her he had no immediate plans to, but she was already unconscious again, and the paramedics were there, and within 90 seconds he had stepped back into the dark in the rain, and the business of saving Isabella Hart was now entirely in other hands. He was treated at the scene for hypothermia and the shoulder injury. He refused transport. He refused to give his name. The paramedic on duty, a young woman who would later describe the encounter to investigators as deeply strange, noted that the man had been insistent to the point of obstinacy, calm but unmovable, the way people are when they have made a decision in advance and are simply executing it. He accepted a thermal blanket. He answered the minimum questions required. And then, before anyone thought to detain him, he walked away into the rain and the darkness. And by the time anyone thought to look for him, the bridge above was crowded enough with responders and onlookers that nobody could say with certainty which direction he had gone. Isabella Hart spent 3 days in a medically induced coma at Coastal General. She had a fractured collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, a severe concussion, and had taken in enough seawater to require significant intervention. The prognosis was guardedly optimistic from the first day, and by the time she regained full consciousness on the morning of the 4th day, the medical team had transitioned from concern to relief. Her personal assistant, Margaret, was in the room when she woke. Her attorney was in the hallway. The CFO had sent flowers the size of a small hedge. What was not in the room, and what had not been in any room in that hospital since the night of the accident, was the man who had pulled her from the water. The nursing staff confirmed what the paramedic report had stated. A man had been treated at the scene. He had refused all identifying information. A hospital administrator had followed up with the first responders as a courtesy, in case the rescuer had required further care, but the trail ended at the scene. The security camera at the bridge approach had captured a partial image, a man in a dark jacket, moving fast, but the resolution was poor, and the angle was wrong, and the rain had made everything worse. Beyond that, there was nothing. No name, no address, no hero presenting himself for the gratitude that the entire city was already, loudly, preparing to deliver. Isabella lay in that hospital bed on the 4th morning, and felt something she had not felt since she was a child. Standing in a parking lot at 7 years old, watching her mother drive away and not come back, she felt owed to someone she could not repay. It was intolerable to her, not because of pride or not entirely because of pride, but because the weight of an unreturnable debt to an unknown person felt like a door that could not be closed, a room she would have to walk past every day without ever being able to see inside. She needed to find him. She told Margaret this before she asked for water. She told her attorney this before she asked about the accident report. By the end of the 4th day, she had already set in motion the apparatus that would eventually, through a long chain of effort and frustration, and one unlikely conversation at a harbor dock, lead her to a small coastal town and a man who had no interest in being found. The reward announcement went out on the 5th day after the accident, timed to coincide with Isabella's first public statement from the hospital. $1 million for information leading to the identification of the man who had pulled her from the submerged vehicle on the night of October 23rd. The number was large enough to generate its own news cycle, which was intentional. By the following morning, it had been picked up by every major outlet on the West Coast, and by afternoon, it had gone national. Isabella's team had a dedicated intake line running within 12 hours of the announcement. By the end of the first week, they had received over 800 calls. The problem with broadcasting a $1 million reward for an unidentified person was that it did not attract the person you were looking for. It attracted everyone else. In the first 3 weeks, the intake team documented over 200 men who claimed, with varying degrees of conviction, to be the rescuer. Some were genuine in their confusion. A few men had actually been near the bridge that night, drawn by the commotion, and had convinced themselves over time that their presence constituted a more active role than it had. Most were simply opportunists. There was a retired firefighter from Bakersfield who arrived with a prepared statement and a notarized affidavit. There was a college student who had fabricated a story so detailed and internally consistent that he passed the initial screening before a single question about the water temperature exposed the whole thing. Isabella reviewed the footage of each interview herself, something her security director had advised against on the grounds of her time. She did not care. She knew what she was looking for. She could not have explained it precisely, but she knew. The hands were part of it. She remembered hands large, roughened, certain, the hands of someone accustomed to physical work, and none of the men who came forward had hands like that. She remembered his voice. She had not been fully conscious. But the brain, even in extremis, retains things the conscious mind doesn't know it is storing. His voice had been low and even. Not the voice of a man in panic, not the voice of a man performing bravery. It was a voice that had made her feel, in the absolute worst moment of her life, that someone who knew what they were doing was there. None of the voices in those interview rooms matched it. She went back to the office. She told everyone she was fine, which was mostly true, and that she was past it, which was not true at all. At 2 a.m, 3 weeks after the accident, she was not reviewing the Meridian acquisition files as her calendar claimed. She was staring at the blurred security image on her personal laptop, running a facial reconstruction program that her head of digital security had quietly procured, watching a pixelated face refuse to resolve into clarity. She kept coming back to the way he had held her wrist when the paramedics arrived. He had not held it like a stranger. He had held it the way you hold something that matters to you, for just a moment, before you let it go. Meanwhile, in a coastal town called Harwick, 2 hours south and a world away, Ethan Cole was sanding the hull of a 30-foot trawler and listening to the sea. Harwick had a population of just under 4,000, a working harbor that smelled of diesel and brine, a diner that opened at 5 a.m, and the particular quality of quiet that only exists in places where everyone knows everyone else's business and has long since decided that most of it isn't worth discussing. Ethan had arrived 6 years ago with a truck, a toolbox, and a reputation he had not shared with anyone. He had set up a small marine repair operation out of a waterfront shed, worked hard, charged fair prices, and over time had become one of those people a community relies on without ever fully examining why they trust them so completely. He fixed engines. He patched fiberglass. He rebuilt the dock equipment at the community harbor when the owner couldn't afford a contractor. He showed up when it was cold and wet and no one else wanted to, which in a harbor town meant he showed up a great deal. He had heard about the reward on the morning it was announced. His neighbor, an older woman named Clara Finch, who ran the bait shop and monitored approximately all news across all platforms simultaneously, had mentioned it over the fence while he was drinking his coffee. He had listened without comment. He had gone inside, turned on the television, watched 30 seconds of the coverage, and turned it off. He made himself another cup of coffee. He went back to work. Whatever the television was offering, the money, the story, the recognition, the grateful billionaire in the white hospital room, he had already decided none of it was his. He was not entirely sure he could have said why. not in words that would have made sense to anyone outside his own head. He only knew that the night on the bridge had been between him and whatever force in the universe was still giving him chances to do things right, and that cashing it in for $1 million and a newspaper photograph would have made it into something it was not. He was aware, in a distant way, that the search continued. Clara updated him periodically whether he wanted the updates or not. 200 people had come forward. Then 300. None of them, evidently, were the right one. He noted this without satisfaction. He hoped Isabella Hart was recovering well. He had looked her up, once, late at night. Out of a curiosity, he did not want to interrogate too closely. He had read 3 paragraphs about her company and 1 about her background, and then closed the browser tab. He knew her type. Or he thought he did. He had been wrong before. Isabella fired her entire investigative team at the 40-day mark and replaced them with one person, herself. She was not, technically, trained as an investigator. What she was, however, was someone who had built a technology company from 11 employees to 4,300 by being constitutionally incapable of accepting incomplete information. She went back to the scene. She walked the stretch of the bridge in daylight, in the rain again because October had no shortage of it, and she walked down to the water line below and stood on the flat rock shelf where the paramedics had found her. She looked at the angle of it. The distance from the road, the darkness. The man had come from somewhere below the bridge. He had been on foot. He had been moving along the coast road, not driving. The paramedic report had noted no second vehicle. He had been heading south, toward the harbor district. She commissioned an analysis of every marine services operation within a 25-mile radius. She interviewed harbor masters. She asked, specifically, about men who worked alone, who had been in the area before dawn on multiple documented occasions, who were known for water-related skill. Most of the names on the list were quickly eliminated. A few took longer. She was narrowing the cone of probability, and she was doing it with the same quiet, systematic patience she brought to every problem that had ever mattered to her. The old fisherman found her on a Tuesday, at the 3rd harbor she visited. When she produced the security image on her phone, he had squinted at it for a long time. He had scratched the back of his neck, and then he had said, slowly, the words that changed everything. That fella looks an awful lot like Ethan Cole. Down in Harwick. He's got a mark on his wrist anchor. Old style. Can't miss it if you're looking. She was in the car before she had fully processed the sentence. She drove to Harwick alone. This was the first decision she made that surprised the people who knew her. Her security director had offered to send a team. A discreet one. Her attorney had advised at minimum a single escort. Isabella had thanked them both and gotten in her own car. She was not entirely sure why the solitude felt necessary, except that whatever had happened on that bridge had been between 2 people, and whatever she was going to say when she found him needed to be said the same way between 2 people, without an audience, without the architecture of her usual life surrounding her. She found him on a Thursday afternoon, in a boatyard, at the south end of the Harwick Harbor. He was working on the hull of a wooden sailboat, his back to her, wearing canvas work clothes and a pair of boots that had seen considerable service. She stood at the edge of the boatyard for a moment before approaching. He was entirely absorbed in what he was doing, the long, steady strokes of a man who found something in manual work that other activities did not provide. She noticed, before anything else, the mark on his left wrist. Even from 10 feet away, she could see the anchor. She introduced herself by her first name only. He turned around and looked at her with the neutral expression of someone who was waiting to understand what was being asked of them. He was lean and weathered, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for most of its life, not unhandsome, but worn in a way that had nothing to do with vanity. His eyes were a steady gray-brown that reminded her of the sea in overcast weather. She said she was looking for someone who had been at the coast bridge on the night of October 23rd. He looked at her for a moment with no change in his expression. Then he set down his tool, slowly, and said, "I'm not sure what you're hoping to find." She said, "I think you saved my life." He did not confirm it immediately. He picked up a cloth and wiped his hands with it, looking down at the cloth rather than at her. Then he said, quietly, "Are you all right?" And something about the directness of it. Not the money, not the recognition, just, "Are you all right?" confirmed everything she had suspected and made her chest tighten in a way she had not anticipated. She told him yes. She told him she had been in the hospital for a week, that she had 3 cracked ribs but was back at work, that she was fine. She waited for the part where he said what he wanted. It did not come. He nodded, and there was something in the nod that looked like relief. And then he said, not unkindly, "I'm glad. I hope you have a safe drive back." She did not move. She had not driven 2 hours to be thanked for her time. She told him she had been looking for him for 6 weeks. She told him about the reward, which he indicated he already knew about, with a slight expression that might have been discomfort. She told him she wanted to compensate him, to acknowledge what he had done, to do something that would begin to close the distance between what she owed and what she could offer. He listened to all of this with the patience of someone who had heard something like it before, in different forms, and had already thought through his answer. When she finished, he said, "I didn't pull you out of the water for money. I pulled you out because it needed doing." He said it without heat, without pride, without any edge of performance. It was simply a statement of what was true. Isabella Hart stood in a boatyard in Harwick, California. And for the first time, in a very long time, she had no next move. The man standing across from her had just declined, with complete equanimity, everything she had ever used as currency. She was, against her will, completely fascinated. He asked her, politely, to leave. He said it without resentment, more the way you ask someone not to track mud through a room, a practical request rather than a rejection. She left. She drove to the edge of town and sat in her car for 15 minutes and thought about the expression on his face when he had asked if she was all right, and she thought about how she could not remember the last time anyone had asked her that first. She booked a room at the only inn in Harwick. She told herself it was because the drive back would be too long in the dark. She told herself this with the practiced efficiency of a woman who was very good at believing what she needed to believe in order to take the next step. In the morning, she went to the Harbor Diner and had coffee. And Clara Finch, who noticed new faces with the vigilance of a seasoned archivist, mentioned the names of half the people in the room within the first 10 minutes. By the afternoon, Isabella knew more about Ethan Cole than his brief profile on the state licensing board had offered. She knew that he fixed boats without charging the elderly fishermen who couldn't afford his rates. She knew that he had replaced the dock lighting at his own cost after the harbor master's budget ran dry. She knew that he had been present at 2 separate water rescues in the past 4 years, neither of which he had ever spoken about publicly. She knew that he was, as far as anyone in Harwick could tell, a man who did not want anything from anyone, and this made him, paradoxically, someone that everyone wanted something from. She found him at the dock the second afternoon, mending a net for an old fisherman named Roy, who had arthritis bad enough to make the work nearly impossible on his own. Ethan looked up when she approached and did not say anything, but he did not tell her to leave again either, which she took as a modification of his position. She sat down on a dock piling and watched him work for a while. Eventually she asked about the anchor tattoo. He glanced at his wrist. He said it was from a long time ago. She asked what it meant. He said it was from the Coast Guard training program. She asked if he had served. He said he had. She asked why he had left. He was quiet for a long time, working the net, and then he said, "I lost someone." He did not say more than that for a long time. She did not push. There was a quality to his silence that felt inhabited, not hostile, not withholding, but the silence of a man who has carried a thing for so long that it has become structural, load-bearing, not something you set aside without understanding what it's holding up. She sat with it. The harbor sounds continued around them. Eventually, over the next hour, in pieces, and not necessarily in order, she came to understand the shape of what he had been carrying for 9 years. Her name had been Laura. They had been together for 4 years when she went out on a private sailing trip with friends, on a day that the forecast had rated as acceptable, and the sea had decided otherwise. Ethan had been on duty 12 miles north. He had heard the distress call. By the time his team reached the vessel, 2 of the 4 people on board had made it into a life raft. Laura had not. The investigation found no negligence. The conditions had been genuinely extreme. It was the kind of accident that is no one's fault and yet requires someone to carry it. And Ethan had decided, without anyone asking him to, that he was the right person. He had stayed with the Coast Guard for another year, doing his job with the same competence he always had. And then he had left and come to Harwick and built the quiet life that he had now, which was a life constructed entirely around not letting it happen again. The boats he fixed, the people he helped, the water he watched every morning. These were not habits. They were a vigil. Isabella listened to all of this, and she thought about the night on the bridge, and she understood, not as an analysis, not as a conclusion, but as something felt that when Ethan Cole had gone into that black water after her, he had not been acting on instinct alone. He had been paying a debt that the universe would never ask him to pay, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to clear. She said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, quietly, "Thank you for telling me that." He looked at her, briefly, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he went back to the net. It was on the 5th evening of her stay, when she had stopped pretending she was leaving tomorrow, that the 3 black SUVs arrived at the harbor. She recognized the vehicles before she recognized the men who stepped out of them. They were acquisition scouts, the polished, expensive, relentless kind that her company employed to prepare the ground before a major real estate transaction. They had clipboards, which was almost charming in its anachronism. And they moved through the harbor with the air of people performing a professional courtesy before doing exactly what they intended to do regardless. Within an hour, word had spread through Harwick, the way word spreads in a town of 4,000 immediately and with embellishment. The harbor and the surrounding commercial waterfront was being purchased. The community docks, the boat sheds, the working operations that had been there for 3 generations, all of it was part of a planned leisure and hospitality development. The existing tenants would have 60 days. Ethan found out the way everyone else did, through Clara, at the diner, where the information was delivered with the gravity of a natural disaster. He stood at the counter and read the summary notice that someone had already photographed and printed. And his face went through something that she, watching from the corner table, did not enjoy seeing. When he looked up and found her eyes across the room, what she saw in his expression was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was disappointment that had been fully expected, delayed only by a willingness to think better of things. He walked over to her table. He sat down across from her without being invited. He placed the notice on the table between them. He said, very quietly, "Is this yours?" She looked at the document. She recognized the subsidiary name on the letterhead. It was 2 layers removed from Heart Dynamics. But it was hers. She had approved the coastal expansion strategy in March without reviewing every component. Her COO had handled the implementation. She had not known the specific parcels. None of this made her feel better, and none of it changed the document on the table between them. She told him she hadn't known. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-brown eyes, and then said, "But you do now." He got up and walked out. The board meeting was called for the following Monday. The acquisition vote was on the agenda. If the harbor parcel was rejected by Isabella over the objections of 3 major shareholders who had specifically lobbied for the coastal development strategy, there would be a motion for leadership review. Her general counsel had used careful language to explain this, but the meaning was plain enough. Cancel the deal and risk the seat she had occupied since the day she had incorporated. The number of people who had been waiting, quietly and patiently, for exactly this kind of opening was not small. She had known this, in the abstract, for years. Power always accumulates its audience of successors. She sat in her room at the Harwick Inn that Sunday night, looking at the harbor through the window, watching the lights of the working boats reflected in the water, and she thought about a question that Ethan had asked her. the second afternoon, before the SUVs arrived, before everything had shifted. He had asked her not unkindly, simply directly, the way he said everything, what she was looking for when she had driven to Harwick alone. She had given him the official answer. She wanted to thank him. He had waited to see if there was another answer. She had not given one. She gave one now, in the privacy of her own mind. Sitting at that window. She had come because the night on the bridge had broken something open in her that she had not known was sealed. Not the accident itself, the moment after, the moment when a stranger in the dark had asked if she was all right before he had asked for anything. She could not remember the last time that had happened. She could not identify, with any specificity, the last time she had sat in a room where she was not the asset, the decision-maker, the problem to be solved, or the opportunity to be leveraged. The weight of that realization, on a Sunday night in a small harbor town, was considerable. She called her general counsel at 9 o'clock. She told him she would be at the board meeting. She told him to prepare the relevant documentation. She did not tell him what her vote would be, because she was a woman who kept her actual decisions private until she was ready to execute them, and because she already knew what she was going to do and did not need the extra 12 hours of lobby and pressure that the information would invite. The Monday board meeting was held in the 42nd floor conference room of the Hart Dynamics Tower, with its floor-to-ceiling view of the bay and the kind of ambient lighting that had been designed by a consultant to project stability and authority. 11 people were seated around the table when Isabella walked in, 5 minutes early, which was unusual for her. She set her phone face down and her legal pad to one side. The COO ran through the acquisition overview. The financial projections were presented. The harbor parcel was described as a cornerstone asset of the coastal leisure corridor, expected to yield a return within 3 years that would meaningfully offset the current quarter headwinds the company was navigating. She waited until the presentation was finished. Then she said, clearly and without preamble, that she was pulling the harbor acquisition from the agenda and instructing the legal team to initiate the withdrawal process. She said it the same way she said everything consequential, without drama, without apology, without the kind of verbal padding that people use when they are hoping to soften a decision they are not fully committed to. She was fully committed. She could see, around the table, the calculation happening in real time, faces reorganizing themselves around the implications. One of the major shareholders, a man named Gerald Park, who had been on the board since year 3 and had never, in Isabella's memory, attended a meeting without an agenda of his own, said that he would be moving for a leadership confidence review at the next session. She told him that was his right. She gathered her legal pad and her phone. She told the room that the harbor was the livelihood of 240 working families, and that her company was not going to end those livelihoods for a leisure corridor, and that if the board disagreed with that decision, the leadership review would give them the opportunity to say so on record, which she thought was the appropriate process. The stock dropped 4.5 percentage points by close of business. 3 financial journalists called it a governance crisis. One called it the first honest thing a tech CEO had done in public in 3 years, which was a backhanded compliment she appreciated more than the others. Her personal attorney told her that she had, in a single afternoon, made herself genuinely vulnerable for the first time in the company's history. She thanked him for the assessment and asked him to check in with the Harwick Harbor tenants to confirm the withdrawal documentation had been received. She drove back to Harwick that evening, not for any reason she had articulated. Just back. The storm had been building for 2 days before it made landfall. The National Weather Service had issued a warning 48 hours out a late-season system, unusually powerful for the latitude, with sustained winds projected at 60 miles an hour, and swells off the coast that the harbor master at Harwick rated as the worst in a decade. The boats that could be moved were moved. The ones that couldn't were secured with extra lines. The harbor cleared of everything non-essential by mid-afternoon, and the town settled into the particular hunkered-down quiet of a coastal community that has learned, over generations, to take the sea seriously. It was late evening when the distress signal came from the Carver, a 40-foot fishing boat that had been caught offshore by a faster storm track than the model had projected. 4 people aboard Roy, who was Clara's brother-in-law and one of the last full-time fishermen working out of Harwick, and 3 younger crew members. The Coast Guard station was 20 miles north. The local volunteer rescue team was 5 people. Ethan was the one they called first, because Ethan was always the one they called first. And he went without being asked twice. Which was also how it always went. Isabella was at the inn when she heard the boat engine. She went to the window and looked out and saw the rescue launch heading out of the harbor into seas that, even from the dock, looked wrong, moving in the heavy, deliberate way that signals something serious underneath. She knew immediately who was on the boat. She pulled on her coat and went to the harbor. It took the rescue team 40 minutes to reach the Carver. The seas were building as the storm's edge arrived, and the swells had developed the irregular, cross-cutting pattern that makes working water more treacherous than straight heavy weather. They transferred 2 crew members from the Carver to the rescue launch, and were preparing to take the other 2 when the wave hit. It was not the largest wave of the night. It was simply the one that arrived at the wrong angle, from the wrong direction, at the moment when the 2 vessels were connected by a transfer line. The Carver rose, and the rescue launch dropped, and the line snapped with a force that sent 2 men overboard simultaneously. One was recovered within 3 minutes. The other was Ethan. He was in the water for 22 minutes. The Coast Guard arrived 8 minutes in. They found him a quarter-mile north of the Carver's position, which told them he had been fighting the current the whole time, not drifting, not passive, working. When they pulled him over the rail, he was hypothermic and had a head laceration from the initial impact, and his breathing was labored in a way that indicated he had taken in more water than he should have. He was alive. He was unconscious. The paramedic on the Coast Guard vessel later said that the evidence suggested he had been in significantly worse shape for the last 5 minutes in the water than his body language had indicated for the first 17, which was consistent with a person who had continued moving on will after the body's useful reserves were gone. Isabella was on the dock when they brought him in. She had been there for 2 hours and 20 minutes, standing in the wind and the rain with the harbor crew, watching the radio for any signal. When the Coast Guard cutter came through the harbor mouth, she was the first person moving toward the mooring, and she was close enough to the dock when they brought him off to see his face under the floodlights, pale and still, in a way that made her throat close, and the word that rose in her was the same one she had said on the flat. Rock below the bridge, the night she had not fully known she was saying it. The word she had spoken to a stranger in the dark, in the worst moment of her life, as an act of pure, desperate human reaching. Please, don't die. He woke on the second morning, which was sooner than the attending physician had initially estimated. The room was quiet. The storm had passed overnight and left behind the crystalline, washed clean air that only exists after serious weather, and the light through the hospital window had the particular clarity of a world that has been rinsed of everything unnecessary. He turned his head, and she was there. Sitting in the chair beside the bed, her coat still on from the night before, her hair, not the careful professional arrangement it had been, the day she walked into his boatyard. She was holding a paper cup of cold coffee and looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was an expression of uncomplicated relief. He said, because it was the first complete thought he was able to form, "You stayed." She said, "I wasn't going anywhere." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He felt the specific gratitude of someone who has been underwater and found air, which was not metaphorical for him, it was entirely literal. Then he looked back at her. He said, carefully, because he was a man who did not say things carelessly, "I don't want you to leave. I mean from my life. Not just the room." He stopped. He looked mildly annoyed at himself, the way people do when they have said a thing more plainly than they intended. "I know you have a whole other world," he added. "I'm not asking you to abandon it. I just—" He stopped again. She set down the paper cup. She said, "I came to Harwick to return a favor. At least that's what I told myself." She paused. "I think I came because the night on the bridge was the first time in years that something happened to me that wasn't about the company, or the acquisition, or the quarter, or the board. It was just me, and the water, and someone who pulled me out. And for some reason, I couldn't let that be over." She looked at his hands on the blanket large, still rough, even in a hospital bed, and she thought about what those hands had done in the dark and the cold, without asking anything in return. "I wasn't looking for a thank you opportunity," she said. "I was looking for the person who reminded me that I was still a person." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the harbor was beginning to come back to life. She could hear engines, the specific sounds of a working port, resuming its business after a storm. Then he said, "Laura used to say that the sea takes things and gives things, and it doesn't ask your permission for either." He looked at the window. "I think she was right." He was quiet again. And then, "I'm sorry I was short with you. At the boatyard." She shook her head. She said it was a reasonable response to the circumstances. He almost smiled. It changed his face considerably. She noted this. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were two people from profoundly different worlds, navigating the gap between those worlds with the careful, often awkward honesty of people who have decided that the gap is worth the effort of crossing. Isabella went back to the city. She took the leadership review. She survived it, by a margin that was narrower than she would have preferred and wider than Gerald Park had planned for. She spent 3 weeks restructuring the coastal development strategy to redirect investment toward renovation rather than displacement. It was, her CFO noted with the cautious enthusiasm of someone who has been surprised by a good idea, actually a stronger long-term position than the original plan. She had Ethan's input on the Harwick Harbor specifically, conveyed through a series of conversations that were officially consultative and unofficially the best parts of her week. The Ethan Cole Maritime Foundation was established in the spring, funded by an initial commitment from Heart Dynamics and a matching grant from 2 other corporate partners that Isabella spent 4 weeks securing through channels she had never previously used for anything this small by her company financial standards. It was not small. It was, as Ethan pointed out on the day the paperwork was finalized, the largest investment in coastal rescue infrastructure on the Northern California coast in 15 years. He looked at the documentation for a long time. He said, "This would have helped." That night with Laura, he said it without grief. Or not only grief, there was something else in it, a kind of settlement. A debt he had been carrying finally finding its proper form of payment, not absolution but acknowledgement. He sat with it for a while. Then he signed the papers. The Harwick Harbor was renovated rather than replaced. The fishing operations were preserved. Roy, whose rescue had set the storm events in motion, became one of the informal advisors to the Foundation's local operations committee, which he took extremely seriously and which Clara found endlessly amusing. The town did not become a destination, because Ethan had politely and firmly suggested that destinations have a way of eliminating the things that make a place worth visiting, and Isabella had agreed after about 30 seconds of reflection. It remained a working harbor town, which was what it had always been, except that it now had better equipment, a fully funded rescue team, and a foundation office in the old cannery building at the north end of the dock that smelled of diesel and salt, and the specific optimism of a project that is trying to do something real. On a Saturday in early April, when the coast had finally warmed enough to be pleasant, they walked out to the bridge. They had talked about going for a while, not morbidly, not as a ritual, but because it felt like the place where the story had started, and there was something in both of them that wanted to see it in daylight, in good weather, as it was, rather than as it had been on that night. The guardrail had been replaced, properly this time, and the drainage grating was new, and the bridge itself looked, as most structures look in spring light, considerably less sinister than it did in the dark and the rain. They stood at the railing and looked down at the water. It was green today, not black, the kind of green that has light moving through it. Isabella had her hands in her coat pockets. She was looking at the water where, somewhere below the current surface, a part of her life had ended and a different part had begun. She thought about the version of herself who had gone off that bridge in October. The version who had been running on competence and momentum, and the professional's long-cultivated ability to mistake the absence of pain for the presence of satisfaction. She did not miss her. She was grateful to her, the way you are grateful to a previous version of yourself for surviving long enough to get you here. But she did not miss her. She took one hand out of her pocket and found his hand beside her on the railing. He did not move or say anything. He just held it, the same way he had held her wrist on the rock in the dark, with a steadiness that had nothing to prove. She said, "That night, you saved my life." He didn't answer immediately. He was watching a fishing boat working its way out of the harbor, the engine settling into its long-distance rhythm. She turned to look at him. "But I don't think you knew," she said, "that you saved my whole life. Not just the night. All of it." He looked at her then, with those gray-brown eyes that had the quality of deep water, not cold, but substantial, with things moving underneath that took time to understand. He didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't need to. He turned back to the water, and his hand stayed in hers, and the spring light came down across the bridge, and the harbor and the sea beyond it, where the swells moved in their ancient, indifferent, beautiful rhythm, taking things and giving things, asking no one's permission. The boats went out. The foundation continued its work. The town remained what it was. And on the bridge where everything had started, two people stood in the morning light and did not need to say what both of them understood. That sometimes the thing that saves you is not the moment of rescue itself, but the question that follows you out of the water, the question of what you do with the life you were just given back.